Somewhere in the internet sludge, around 40K, somebody made the joke that orcs were based on people from New Jersey. The joke got traction, replies stacked up, and then, a few responses down, the correction landed. No, they're basically English football hooligans. This debate shows up everywhere the 40K community gathers. Someone posts, "Reminder that orcs are based on English hooligans" on Grimdank. Someone on r/40K lore calls them an incredibly exaggerated caricature of football hooligans in the 1980s. A separate thread titled, "Originally the Orks were meant to reference British football fans," draws its own pile of arguments. An entire YouTube video asks, "Why do Orks is English?" Everybody has a theory about the real-world DNA behind the greenest, loudest, and most enthusiastically violent faction in the 41st millennium. Almost nobody brings receipts. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to make the strongest evidence-based case for where these lunatics actually come from. Not with vibes, not with memes, not with some vague hand wave at British culture. We're going to trace the orc back to its first printed appearance, cross-reference it against what was actually happening in Britain at that exact moment, and show, with specific textual evidence, academic analysis, and the faction's own dialogue, how strongly Warhammer 40K orcs map onto something extremely specific. But first, a 60-second detour for the completionists. In the 40K universe, orcs have an origin that stretches back millions of years. An ancient species called the Old Ones, the closest thing the galaxy had to benevolent gods, created a warrior race called the Orks. These were engineered war beings, created to help defend the Milky Way during the setting's deep prehistory. The Orks weren't bumbling green idiots with scrap metal guns. They were ancient combat organisms, described in later lore as far more formidable than modern greenskins. Then the Old Ones fell. Later lore presents modern orcs as degraded descendants of the ancient Orks, smaller, cruder, and far more interested in clobbering things with a choppa than executing any grand strategic directive. That degraded product is the modern orc, a fungal, self-replicating, violence-obsessed species that breeds through spores and exists in a permanent state of joyful warfare. Ancient bioweapons, Old Ones. Millions of years between then and now, sorted. But orcs aren't what anybody means when they type, "What are orcs actually based on?" Nobody's asking about fictional paleontology. They want to know what real-world culture the orcs most clearly channel. To answer that, you have to understand what Nottingham looked like in 1986. Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader was designed and written in Britain in 1986 and 1987. The creative team worked out of Games Workshop's base in Nottingham, a mid-sized city in the East Midlands. Rick Priestley, identified by the community and GW itself as the creator of 40K and co-creator of Warhammer Fantasy, was the driving force behind the setting. When he's discussed the broad influences on Rogue Trader's alien races in interviews since, he's cited Tolkien-style orcs and Heinlein Starship Troopers as part of the mix. Jervis Johnson would go on to author the second edition codex, Orks. John Blanche, whose association with Games Workshop dated back to White Dwarf issue 4 in January 1977, defined the visual identity of the universe across decades. These were British men working in a British city, building a British product during a very particular moment in British cultural history. One of the most visible cultural flashpoints of that moment was football hooliganism. And the orcs make a lot more sense once you understand what that actually looked like on the ground. By the mid-1980s, football-related violence wasn't a fringe concern in Britain. The UK government had been waging a wide-scale crackdown on football-related violence since the early part of the decade, and the problem showed no signs of disappearing. The word hooliganism landed on front pages with the regularity of weather reports. Major hooligan firms, organized groups of violent supporters attached to specific football clubs, operated in every city with a professional team. Each firm had its own name, its own colors, traditions, and pecking order, and each one existed for the same basic purpose: to travel to matches and start a war with the opposing fans. A match day in 1980s England was a sensory experience before anybody kicked a ball. Thousands of men packed onto concrete terraces, no seats, just standing room, shoulder to shoulder, the crowd swaying like a single organism. The noise started low and built. Chants adapted from pop songs and pub standards, short, repetitive phrases designed to be bellowed by thousands of voices in unison, each side trying to drown the other out until the sound became something you felt in your chest more than heard with your ears. Here we go, here we go, here we go. A phrase so embedded in terrace culture, it became shorthand for the experience of a football mob on the move. Other anthems pulled from unlikely sources. I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles at West Ham, Blue Moon at Manchester City, Sunshine on Leith at Hibernian. Borrowed melodies, weaponized through volume and collective force. The violence that erupted before, during, and after matches followed its own internal logic. Oxford University research has concluded that hooliganism isn't a random behavior, and that members of hooligan groups aren't necessarily dysfunctional people outside of the football community. These were men who held normal jobs Monday through Friday. Electricians, builders, office clerks. On match day, the group identity fused with their personal identity, and the aggression became social, bonded, almost ritualistic. Academic research found that team identification directly predicted violent intentions. The stronger someone identified with the group, the more willing they became to engage in confrontation on its behalf. Psychology Today's summary of the research demographic noted that when most people think of a hooligan, they imagine a young, typically male, troublemaker associated with toxic masculinity. The reality was simultaneously more ordinary and more unsettling. These weren't outcasts. They belonged to something, and the belonging was the engine. The fighting itself was collective and escalatory. Small groups probed for weakness. Larger groups surged forward when they sensed numerical advantage. Chanting preceded charges the way artillery precedes infantry. Noise used to intimidate, to build confidence in the attacking group, to make the mass feel larger and more dangerous than any individual in it. When two firms met in a side street or a train station underpass, the confrontation was fast, loud, and driven by the same feedback loop every time. The group made the individual braver, the bravery made the noise louder, the noise made the group feel bigger, and the feeling of bigness made the charge feel inevitable. Then fists, then boots, then scatter and regroup and do it again. A parallel development added a fashion dimension. Up until the summer of 1983, the subculture within hooliganism that would later become known as the casuals had no single unifying name. Liverpool called them scowls, Manchester called them Perrys, Leeds called them dressers. Every city had its own variant. The core idea was the same everywhere. Ditch the club scarves and rosettes that made you immediately identifiable as a football supporter. Replace them with expensive designer sportswear and blend into the crowd. Walk through a train station without a single police officer giving you a second glance. Then, when you reach the destination, erupt into the same coordinated violence you were always going to commit. The Museum of Youth Culture's retrospective notes that the casuals also maintained and extended another tradition of British soccer, hooliganism, and that Britain's casual football firms punctuated the early 1980s. The casual movement was, functionally, a stealth upgrade for groups whose fundamental nature was loud, tribal, and confrontational. The ambition was subtlety. The execution was a mob in designer tracksuits. They adopted the trappings of respectability while remaining, at the operational level, exactly the same groups they'd been before the wardrobe change. The British media covered all of this with tabloid-grade intensity, framing hooligans as the national folk devil. One academic analysis described the media's approach as intentionally escalating attention to drive a moral panic, deploying language calibrated to present working-class football supporters as a civilizational threat. The framing included terms like brutal, young, working class, loud, tribal, traveling in enormous packs, fighting for reasons that made complete sense inside the group and absolutely zero sense to anyone outside it. That is the Britain in which Games Workshop sat down to design their alien races. The Ork sourcebook published for the Rogue Trader era was titled Ere We Go, Orks in Warhammer 40,000, a 1991 hardback expanding on material developed in the late 1980s. That title isn't random Ork gibberish. Ere We Go is a phonetic transcription of Here We Go and Here We Go, Here We Go, Here We Go is one of the most recognizable football terrace chants in British history. The same phrase appears in the lore as a common Ork chant heard during a greenskin wah. In universe, it's a war cry. In the real world, the echo of a terrace anthem is hard to miss. The title of the faction's first dedicated book carries the DNA of a football mob heading to an away match, with the serial numbers filed off and a coat of green paint slapped on top. The dialect goes far deeper than one title. Ork dialogue was written in Cockney, or more precisely, Mockney, an exaggerated, performed version of working-class London English, from the very earliest printed material, years before any video game gave Orks an audible voice. Translation scholarship studying the Ork dialect for a Polish localization of Dawn of War II described it as a variant of English, in some respects also resembling Cockney. An official Games Workshop product released in 2025, Words of Wa, features the line, "We is gonna stomp the universe flat and kill anything that fights back. We is gonna do this 'cause we's Orks, and we was made to fight and win." Every syllable of that is performing a specific accent. Walk through it. We is, standard English compressed into the shortest possible form. Universe, universe respelled phonetically. Anything, the classic TH fronting where TH becomes F. Cuz, because with the front hacked off. Was respelled to match the sound. We's Orks, identity reduced to a clipped, punchy contraction. This is exaggerated Cockney-inflected writing, not generic alien babble. The phonetic choices are consistent, systematic, and recognizable to anyone who's heard the real accent. David Prangle, in a university thesis analyzing Warhammer 40,000 as a cultural text, directly states that the language the Orks use strongly resembles that associated with British hooligans. The same thesis notes that the first edition Ork book was called Ere We Go, drawing an explicit line between Ork speech patterns and real-world British subculture. Another academic analysis of Ork localization also identifies the dialect as Cockney-like. Put those together and the pattern is hard to ignore. Orks talk like working-class Londoners, and that voice was built into the faction from print, not grafted on later by voice actors. The misconception that Ork voices originated with Dawn of War in 2004 is one of the most persistent in the fandom. The video game gave Orks booming, full-throated Cockney delivery through voice acting for the first time. And for many international players who'd been reading Ork dialogue for years, that was the moment the accent finally registered. Phonetic spelling doesn't automatically trigger a British class marker if you didn't grow up hearing it. Anything on a page is just funny misspelling if you've never met someone who pronounces it that way. But the Mockney was baked into the printed material from the late 1980s. The sculptor Brian Nelson changed the visual look of Orks when he was hired prior to 3rd edition's release. But the voice, the dropped H's, the fronting, the Ere We Go, had been there for well over a decade before any Ork ever spoke through a game speaker. Dawn of War turned up the volume. It didn't write the song. The speech is the clearest evidence, but the behavioral logic runs just as deep. Ork Codex text across editions hammers the same profile. Orks live for battle and want nothing more than to fight and to kill. Their resilience and belligerence are all but unmatched by the other races of the galaxy, and their immeasurable numbers threaten to crush all who stand against them. Individual orks are described as brutal, simplistic, and highly aggressive. The 10th edition rules review describes the faction's tactical identity. Orks are a pressure army. They want to get in the opponent's face and start crumping with overwhelming force. The mathematical logic of an ork army breaks down to something like, make 100 attacks, except that only a fraction will land, and rely on the sheer volume to overwhelm whatever the opponent can field. Numbers are the strategy. Mass is the weapon. But raw aggression isn't what makes orks structurally unusual. Plenty of 40k factions field dangerous fighters. Space Marines are individually lethal. Tyranids attack in swarms. What makes orks different is that their power is tied to the crowd. The Wa is the core idea. It's commonly described as a psychic field generated by collective ork belief and aggression. A shared force tied to masses of orks surging into the same fight. The bigger the mob, the bigger the Wa. The louder the noise, the more the whole thing feeds on itself. And every ork in the middle of it's having the time of his life, because violence isn't a means to an end for an ork. It's the end. The fight is the point. The charge is the reward. The Wa is the moment when individual consciousness dissolves into collective fury and the whole thing becomes bigger than any single greenskin. Describe that social behavior without the science fiction framing. A group of beings whose confidence and aggression increase with mob size. Beings who travel in enormous packs. Beings who chant repetitive phrases to build collective energy before surging into confrontation. Beings whose entire social identity revolves around which tribe they belong to, which leader they follow, and which rival group they're about to fight. Beings who view violence not as a regrettable necessity, but as the highest form of social participation. That's strikingly close to the social logic of a football firm heading to an away match in 1985. The feedback loop is identical. Group makes the individual braver, bravery makes the noise louder, noise makes the group feel larger, the feeling of largeness makes the charge feel inevitable. Oxford's research identified social bonding, not individual pathology, not poverty, not stupidity, as a key driver of hooliganism. The psychological mechanism was specific. Members became so fused with the collective identity that confrontation felt natural, even joyful. Orks run on the same loop, except Games Workshop gave it a science fiction explanation and called it Wa energy. Ork clans function as the 40k equivalent of hooligan firms, right down to the colors and the mutual contempt. Goths wear black and believe in hitting things harder than anyone else. They're the purists, the ones who think fighting should be done face to face with the biggest possible choppa. Evil sons paint everything red and live for speed, tearing across battlefields in ramshackle vehicles, because getting there fast matters more than getting there intact. Bad moons have the most teeth, the ork currency, literally their own teeth, which grow back continuously, and flaunt their wealth through flashier gear and bigger guns. Death Skulls steal everything that isn't nailed down and paint themselves blue for luck. Snakebites reject technology and ride into battle on squigs, the fungal beasts that share the ork ecosystem. And then there are the Blood Axes, the weirdos. Blood Axes trade with the Imperium. They study human military tactics. They adopt concepts that no other ork clan would touch voluntarily. Rank structures, coordinated signals, camouflage, strategic planning. Their colors are green and drab, not bright clan markings. They use military terminology. They have corps and corporals. Every other clan looks at the Blood Axes with deep suspicion, the way a firm would look at someone who started reading the opponent's match program instead of throwing it. The inter-clan rivalry is constant and physical. Goths think evil sons are too obsessed with going fast. Evil sons think Goths have no style. Everybody thinks blood axes are suspiciously un-orky for cooperating with humies. Fistfights between clans break out over nothing. Entire settlements can devolve into brawls when two groups decide the other lot looked at them funny. But the moment an external threat shows up, a Space Marine strike force, a Tyrannid swarm, an Eldar war host, every clan drops the infighting and unites behind the nearest war boss. The Wa subsumes the rivalries. The mob becomes one, and the entire green tide rolls forward as a single screaming, spectacularly violent mass. The resemblance to British football hooliganism becomes hard to miss when you lay them side by side. Internal tribal rivalry that can turn violent on a Tuesday. External tribal unity that overrides everything else when the real opposition arrives. Colors and identity markers that signal allegiance at a glance. Hierarchy established through physical dominance and force of personality. Violence as the bonding agent that holds the whole structure together. These aren't the social mechanics of a random barbarian horde. They map to a very specific type of organized, identity-driven, confrontation-seeking subculture. Which brings us to the Commandos, and the single funniest exhibit in the entire case. Commandos are the Blood Axe's sneaky specialists. Lore describes them as orcs fond of sneaky type of warfare, experts in laying ambushes and unsuspected attacks, epitomizing what the text calls the orky virtue of low cunning. Their listed combat specialties are camouflage and stealth. Games Workshop's own promotional material references Blood Axe sneaky signals and other well-cunning comms. On paper, if you squinted very hard and ignored everything you knew about orc physiology, you might mistake them for a credible reconnaissance force. Corporal Snagbrat of the Dreadblade Commandos captures the Blood Axe worldview in a line of dialogue preserved in the faction's lore page. Us Blood Axes have learnt a lot from Dahumis. How best to kill 'em, for example. That single sentence is the entire joke distilled into 9 words. Blood Axes studied human culture. What did they absorb? Murder techniques. The adoption of human methods is entirely instrumental, processed through a brain that still fundamentally runs on orc logic. Learning and understanding are 2 completely different cognitive operations, and the Blood Axes have performed one without getting anywhere near the other. Picture what a commando operation looks like in practice. A squad of massive, green-skinned berserkers smears dark paint across their faces. They crouch behind a rock formation. They've agreed on sneaky hand signals. They've brought Kunin equipment. They wait. They're quiet. Astonishingly quiet by orc standards. 20 seconds pass. 30. One of them is vibrating. Another one's jaw is working, grinding his tusks together, fighting every biological impulse in his fungal nervous system. The ambush is almost set. The enemy patrol is in the kill zone. Steady. Steady. Wow! The entire plan collapses in a single, bellowed syllable as orc biology overrides tactical theory. Every commando charges, screaming from cover, firing from the hip, hitting only some of what they're aiming at, and having the absolute time of their lives. The ambush, technically, works, in the sense that the enemy is surprised, because nobody expects a shrieking green wall to erupt from a position that appeared to be an empty hillside 3 seconds ago. But stealth in any Imperial Assassin or Eldar Ranger sense of the word? Absolutely not. The parallel to the casual movement in early 1980s Britain is where the satirical precision of the whole thing sharpens to a point. The casuals, remember, were functionally a stealth upgrade for hooligans. Ditch the scarves and colors that made you identifiable. Replace them with designer sportswear that let you blend into train platforms and high streets without triggering police attention. Walk through a city center looking like you were headed somewhere civilized. Then, at the appointed time and place, erupt into the same coordinated aggression you were always going to commit. The whole point was to apply a veneer of respectability, sophisticated fashion, measured behavior, no obvious tribal markers, over groups whose fundamental nature was loud, tribal, and confrontational. The casuals bought the outfit. They learned the vocabulary. They adopted the visual language of a different social class. And the moment the adrenaline kicked in, the underlying identity reasserted itself with full force. Designer jackets and expensive trainers didn't change what happened when two firms met in an underpass. They just changed what the participants looked like on the CCTV footage 3 minutes before it started. Commandos are the same joke written at alien scale. They've learned the words camouflage, signals, ambush, stealth. They've studied the playbook. They've put on the drab colors. And the moment contact is made, the underlying biology overrides everything. The gap between what they believe they're doing and what they're actually doing is the entire comedic engine. The faction isn't bugged. The faction is the bug, elevated to a design principle. Ork vehicles occupy a slightly different space in the cultural blueprint, and this is where honest calibration matters. Ork machines vary wildly in size, construction, and weaponry, built by mechs who customize them with flashy bits and improvised armor plating that bolsters protection through sheer scrap metal coverage. No two Ork vehicles look the same. Everyone is personalized, modified, and assembled from whatever wreckage, salvage, and stolen parts the mech could get his hands on. The weapon loadouts are improvised. The armor plating is uneven. Exhaust pipes belch black smoke. Spikes and rams jut from every surface. The aesthetic is maximum aggression assembled with minimum engineering standards. Speed freaks, the Ork subculture defined by velocity obsession, hold a belief recorded in Rogue Trader-era material. Painting a vehicle red makes it go faster. And because Ork belief generates that psychic field, the red ones genuinely do go faster. The conviction creates the result. It's superstition that works, which is either the most terrifying or the most hilarious thing in the 40K universe, depending on your perspective. Longtime Oldhammer discussion has noted that the original Ork vehicle visual style drew more from biker and Mad Max aesthetics than from anything parked outside a football ground. Fan hobbyists routinely build Mad Max-inspired Speed Freaks conversions, and the connection to Road Warrior vehicular chaos is visible in the miniatures themselves. Welded roll cages, scrap armor panels, exposed engines, the whole post-apocalyptic scrapyard vocabulary. The hooligan influence on this reading was aimed more at their attitudes towards fighting for no reason than at the visual design of the machines themselves. That distinction is worth respecting. The silhouette of an Ork truck owes more to biker and post-apocalyptic scrap culture than to the car park at Elland Road. But the attitude running through every exhaust pipe still reads as something culturally specific. The conviction that you can take something mass-produced, rip it apart, bolt on aggressive modifications, make it louder and faster and more dangerous than the manufacturer ever intended, and then drive it at irresponsible speeds while your mates hang off the sides cheering. That reads like a caricature of the boy racer and scrapyard mod culture that ran parallel to hooliganism in 1980s Britain. Modified escorts with oversized exhausts tearing down ring roads. Souped-up Vauxhalls with racing stripes and aftermarket everything, driven by the same demographic that filled the terraces on Saturday afternoon. The car wasn't transport. It was identity, status through modification. Proof you could make something out of nothing and make it scream. Red ones go faster is the Ork version of putting a racing stripe on a Ford and believing it added 10 horsepower. Except in the 40K universe, believing hard enough actually bends physics. In the interest of accuracy, because this audience will spot overclaims from orbit, the hooligan connection isn't the sole ingredient in the Ork recipe. Priestley's own comments cite Tolkien-style orcs and Heinlein's Starship Troopers as part of the rogue trader alien race design pool. The green skin, the tusks, the brute physicality. That lineage traces through decades of fantasy fiction before Games Workshop existed. The fungal biology, the spore-based reproduction, the genetically encoded technical knowledge, pure science fiction invention. No real-world subculture maps onto those features. And the vehicle aesthetic, as noted, pulls from biker and post-apocalyptic imagery alongside any British street culture influence. Multiple community members across different forums and threads have attributed the hooligan connection directly to Jervis Johnson, who authored the second edition Codex Orks. I know Jervis Johnson himself said that orcs are British football hooligans is a claim that appears in 40K lore discussions with the regularity of a fixture list. But no primary source interview transcript with that exact statement has surfaced in publicly available material. The textual evidence, though, doesn't need a creator to explain it. You don't need a designer to tell you that "we is gonna stomp de universe flat" is Cockney inflected. You don't need a development diary to recognize that "ere we go, ere we go, ere we go" echoes a football chant. You don't need an interview to see that a society organized around mob violence, tribal loyalty, collective chanting, hierarchies of physical dominance, and the pure, unadulterated joy of beating the daylights out of someone is drawing from a very specific real-world behavioral template. David Prangle saw it in a university thesis. Translation scholars saw it in a localization study. Thousands of fans across Reddit, forums, and comment sections have seen it independently and said the same thing in their own words. The text does the talking. It has been doing the talking since 1987. The strongest formulation of the evidence is this: orcs are a composite creation. Their visual DNA draws from fantasy orcs, post-apocalyptic biker culture, and science fiction body horror. Their biology is pure invented lore. But the behavioral core, the speech, the mob dynamics, the chanting, the tribal structure, the clan rivalries, the identity fusion, the escalation through numbers, the attitude toward violence as the highest form of entertainment, looks an awful lot like 1980s British football terrace culture processed through a funhouse mirror. The mirror made them 7 feet tall. The mirror made them green and fungal. The mirror gave them psychic fields and spore reproduction and weapons that shouldn't technically function. But the reflection underneath is still recognizable if you know what you're looking at. A species that chants "ere we go" before charging in a mob. A species whose power scales with the size and noise of the crowd. A species organized into rival clans that brawl constantly among themselves, but fuse into a unified horde the instant an outside enemy appears. A species whose attempt at stealth involves copying the surface trappings of a more sophisticated culture, while remaining fundamentally, biologically, joyfully incapable of being anything other than what they are. A species that modifies scrap vehicles into screaming projectiles of personalized aggression and genuinely believes that the color of the paint affects the speed. That faction was designed in Nottingham in 1986 and 1987 at the absolute peak of British football hooliganism's public visibility by a team of British designers who breathed that cultural atmosphere every day. The Ork sourcebook bore the title, "Ere we go," echoing a terrace chant. The dialect was Cockney inflected from the earliest printed material. The mob psychology lines up uncannily well with academic descriptions of hooligan group dynamics. The Commandos read like the casual movement pushed into maximum absurdist comedy. And the whole thing has been running continuously for nearly 4 decades without the joke getting old. Because the satire was never lazy. The phonetic speech patterns are consistent and specific. The group identity mechanics are structurally accurate. The parody of stealth through fashion maps onto a real subcultural phenomenon. Even the red paint superstition has a real emotional logic. The belief that modification equals performance, that looking fast makes you fast, that conviction alone can override engineering. Orks aren't random comic relief. They aren't generic fantasy orcs handed a bolter and told to yell. They're best read as a satirical portrait of a specific subculture, drawn by designers who were living inside that cultural moment. The 40K universe runs on satire. The Imperium satirizes fascism. The Mechanicus satirizes religious fundamentalism. The Eldar satirize declining empires convinced of their own superiority. But the Orks might be the sharpest satirical creation in the whole setting, because they take a real human behavior, the joy of collective tribal violence, the belonging that comes from being part of a mob, and present it with such exaggerated affection that you're laughing before you recognize what you're looking at. That's the answer. It was never New Jersey. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one.